Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Well, as we know, the Iranians are meeting with other signatories to the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, in Vienna. The Americans are also present, but the talks with the Americans and the Iranians are happening in an indirect fashion and not directly. There has been seemingly a broad roadmap which has been agreed upon for a return of the United States to the deal. Nevertheless, the Iranians insist that all sanctions must be lifted in one go for them to essentially come back into compliance as well and to stop those decisions that they have made regarding enrichment, et cetera, at the same time. How does one exactly square that circle? I mean, there is all this positive talk, and the words being used by both sides are that these talks were constructive, et cetera, but were they really that constructive? I mean, will the Americans lift all the sanctions in one go, or are the Iranians, in fact, ready to compromise on that altogether? Let's discuss that a bit further. And I'm joined by Dr. James Devine, who is an associate professor in Department of Politics and International Relations at Mount Allison University. He's joining us this morning from Sackville, New Brunswick. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Reza, who's a research fellow at Sharif University think tank. He's also a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford. And joining us from Arlington, Virginia is Yousof Azizi, who is a researcher of U.S. foreign policy decision-making. He's also a PhD candidate at Virginia Tech. James, Reza, and Yousof, good morning to all three of you, and thank you for your time today. James, let me start with you. As I said, a lot of positive talk, a lot of positive vibes seemingly in the air, but the insistence on all sanctions being lifted in one go seems to be remaining consistent from the Iranian side. Will the Americans play ball in that regard?
Well, I think the two working group model that we've got coming out of the meetings is probably the best we could hope for. The idea that everything is going to be done at once is probably unrealistic, but I think both sides are going to be able to work out a way, or are going to try to work out a way, where things are done simultaneously, but they are able to frame things in a way so that nobody loses face. So, for instance, Iran was saying they would not involve themselves in indirect talks with the Americans, but of course that's actually what's happened. They just called it proximity talks, or at least some of the observers have. So there are diplomatic ways, creative diplomatic ways of getting around the question of simply who goes first. It's going to be a bit of a dance that's going to have to be choreographed, but it is possible.
And Reza, there's a lot, obviously, that both sides disagree on as well. What kind of obstacles possibly do you see going forward? Or do you think that they'll be able to, as James said, diplomatically work this out such that there are possibilities to do what both of them want and domestically come out as victorious?
Yeah, it seems to me right now a very, very difficult road ahead. You look at the past almost 5 years, 4 years, primarily with Trump, obviously, with over 1,000 sanctions imposed on Iran. And when we hear what's coming out of Tehran as far as the type of sanctions they want lifted, many of those sanctions might be difficult for the U.S. to lift because of the complexity of how the Trump administration imposed those sanctions. So one example I feel might be the main example is the sanctions on the Central Bank of Iran. It has been sanctioned under two names, essentially. One is under its role as far as Iran's oil exports, but then it's also sanctioned under terrorism. Now, as far as the Biden administration being able to lift those sanctions, both of those sanctions, in order for that bank to help Iran export oil, seems difficult when it comes to the terrorism sanctions. I doubt he has the political will and the political power to do that. And I feel that's where these types of negotiations, right now in Vienna might hit a roadblock where, but then again, on the one side, you have the U.S. State Department, who was it, Ned Price, their spokesman, saying that they are willing to remove those sanctions that are inconsistent. But again, those are just talking points right now. I feel like both sides, again, have to appease to their domestic base.
Indeed.
But then also kind of give this, I guess optimistic view. But I'm pretty pessimistic right now, just to see what happens. We'll see what happens Friday. But for now, it seems very difficult.
Yousof, what are your thoughts on that? Because the one huge reality as well that many people have spoken about is the Iranian elections, right? And the need, seemingly at least, according to some experts, to support the reformist camp, as in Rouhani, going into these elections, even though, of course, he's not standing in these elections himself personally. Is that a factor, do you think? Because there's also then the other argument that, in fact, Biden's gone fairly slow in this process as well.
Yeah, I agree with you and other guests that it is not something that happened very soon between Iran and United States to come back to full compliance under the JCPOA. But on the other hand, as our U.S. Special Envoy Robert Malley, he said that the Iran election is not a part of the factor that they put it, into the deal, into their decisions. But I don't agree. I think that one of the reasons Iran doesn't agree with the step-by-step process the United States suggested is because the United States they found the capability to affect the Iranian domestic politics. So Iranian decision-making, Iranian political system want to dismiss that. Although the Iranian, all of them, the parliament, the executive branch, the supreme leader, all of them wants to, to reach to the position that the United States, that Iran come back to the full compliance within 2 months, within less than 2 months, as soon as possible. But on the other hand, Iranian rejected the step-by-step. One, because the United States has the hand to, to affect the Iranian domestic politics, the Iranian election, and also the United States can, ask for further negotiation for extending the nuclear talk or going for the further talk for the regional security in the future. So all of the Iranian policymakers, decision makers wanted that the sanction lifted at once because of these side effects that have for the step-by-step situation.
Yeah, and James, one of the interesting factors here, which has always been the reality, is that even under Obama, he didn't have the votes in the Senate, right, to be able to pass this through the Senate and Congress. So he passes through executive order, and that's the reality for Biden as well. I mean, if, and hypothetically speaking, if he were to be able to re-enter the Iran nuclear deal and or come to some sort of a new agreement, he doesn't have the votes either, which would support him in this regard. Because, in fact, just recently, a number of lawmakers, bipartisan group of lawmakers, said that they want the deal, in fact, to be extended to include other issues, ballistic missiles, regional activities, etc. What do you make of that?
Well, Biden would have to do it the same way Obama did, and that's, as a long-term problem, that's a serious issue for the Americans. Biden is not going to, will receive a lot of criticism for any deal that he signs. It will be impossible to satisfy the hardliners on the American side. So he's going to leave himself vulnerable over the long term to criticisms. At the same time, too, he campaigned on this issue. He has made it a part of his policy agenda. It's hard to believe that he didn't expect these sorts of impediments going forward. So I think he's going to try, and he'll probably try and do it the same way Obama did. But it's going to be a rocky road for him, certainly.
Right. So then, on the Iranian side, Reza, I wonder, this whole argument about reformist versus principlist or conservative, if we're using more mainstream terms. Is that really that different from the Iranian domestic side? Because at this point, the two sides in Iran seem like they're on the same page when it comes to what they want from the United States, right? When it comes to this deal, I mean, one side may be willing to compromise a tad bit more, but it seems like the stance has hardened a lot in Iran, right?
Yeah, it has hardened, and that is to the fault, I believe, of the Trump administration, and maybe broader, just Washington, D.C. I recall, certain quotes from Supreme Leader, Khamenei, early in 2013, 2014, where he said this would be a test for us to see if we can trust, these countries, with the United States and also the EU. He says if we can, if it does lead to positive outcomes, then we can maybe potentially look at other, issues to also, reach the, table and also to negotiate. And now that we've seen what has happened, obviously in these past 4 or 5 years, they've all toed the same line, whether you're a principlist, reformist, conservative, whatever you want to call it. And now when it comes to their elections, in Tehran coming up in June, I don't believe that is a concern, because when we look at Iran's foreign policy, it goes where Khamenei wants it to go. I think that's almost regardless to who the president is. And again, with Iran going into their, season for the elections, as far as I know right now, no one in Rouhani's administration, cabinet, what have you, has declared or shown interest that they are running, except I believe for his vice president. So that shows that even when you see Iran domestically in the full thick of their presidential season, Rouhani's team can still negotiate, can still come to a deal, and then whoever becomes the next president would have to follow more or less what he is being told from Khamenei's camp, with these negotiations.
So Yousof, contextualize for us right now, what do you think the Iranians are thinking? I mean, are they desperate enough? I don't want to use that word, but that's the best word I can think of at this point in time. Desperate enough to compromise and then include other issues such as the ballistic missile program and even regional activities. I mean, is Iran under that much pressure because of the maximum pressure campaign that Donald Trump brought in?
I don't think so. As I said previously to your program, that at your program, the maximum pressure reached to its capital, to its maximum capacity. So there is no more economic pressure on Iran right now, and during these years, Iranian can resist against that. They now sell oil more than whatever they sold 1 year ago, 2 years ago. So I mean that with respect to the new deal with China and also maybe upcoming deal, strategic deal with Russia. So we can see that Iranian try to nullify, try to cancel out what's happening through the maximum pressure. And on the other hand, Iranian has some other leverage, other tools. For example, in these advantages and improvement in their nuclear capability, in 20% enrichment, in using the advanced centrifuge, and limiting the inspection by the IAEA. So I mean, if you put all of these into one category and see the United States as either Obama administration, Trump administration, even Biden administration, they want to transfer the resources and focus from Middle East to East Asia. So the first step to handle the security in the Middle East, or even go with the further talk with Iranian over the security issues, the regional security, the first step is to handle and settle the JCPOA, the agreement, to rejoining and restoring the JCPOA. If that's happened and the trust between those countries built up, then I think that maybe in the following years, there would be a chance to talk about the regional security negotiation. But right now, I'm sure there is no one in Iran wants to go further than a nuclear talk.
James, we're quickly running out of time, so I just want to give you the final word. We have about a minute and a half left. What are the geopolitical considerations, do you think, for the Americans? Regional allies, many of them don't like the deal, never like the deal. But then at the same time, as Yousof there mentioned, the whole pivot to Asia is also a huge reality for the Americans, isn't it?
Well, as we saw yesterday with a strike against an Iranian ship in the Red Sea, the Israelis are obviously very unhappy with all of this, and they were sending a signal, both I think to the Americans and to the Iranians, that their interests and their preferences aren't going to be ignored. Whether they're going to do enough to actually destabilize or sabotage any process is a different matter. But they are sending a signal to the Americans saying, if you go down this road, you will be harming our relationship. Again, I think what it comes down to is this is not a surprise for Biden. He knew this going in. You would have to expect that he has, he's anticipated this, and he's going to be willing to pay some cost.
Indeed. Well, we'll leave there at that, but we really appreciate James, Reza, and Yousof for their time this morning, speaking to us, respectively. They're from Sackville, Washington, and Arlington, sharing their expertise with us about these Vienna talks that are taking place between Iran as well as other signatories to the JCPOA. The Americans at this point in time, of course, having walked away from the deal under Donald Trump, are at this point in time in indirect talks with the Iranians, i.e. not sitting around the table directly speaking to the Iranian delegation. Nevertheless, every side saying that the talks have been constructive so far. But how do you square the circle, as I said in my introduction, of the realities? The Iranians want all sanctions lifted in one go. Is it, as James said, that within diplomatic circles there will be mechanisms to be able to satisfy both sides, as well as then keep their domestic audiences happy as well, and to save face, seemingly, for both sides and their legacies and political careers also? That, of course, is a wait-and-see game overall. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, known by its abbreviation, GERD. There have been tripartite talks that have taken place between the Egyptians, the Sudanese, as well as the Ethiopians. Those talks did not go very far. There wasn't much progress made in these talks because the sticking point is about mediation as well, regarding this disagreement between the three countries over the dam that Ethiopia has pretty much already built. It's now a question of, obviously, the effect that this will have on the Nile River, specifically for the Egyptians, and then also for the Sudanese on their own dams and infrastructure as well. The Ethiopians say that only the African Union should be the one mediating, but the other two want, in fact, the likes of the European Union and others also from the international community to be a part of this mediation process at this time. The Egyptians have also, the Egyptian president, Sisi, has also pretty much come out with quite a significant threat, saying that if there is an impact on Egypt, then there will be, essentially, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, consequences of sorts, possibly meaning violence of some sort. And again, maybe I'm reading too much into that statement of his altogether. Let's discuss all of this a bit further. We're now joined by Adel, who is a historian, author, commentator. He's also warned of this very specific crisis in his 1993 co-authored book named Water Wars, Coming Conflict in the Middle East. He is joining us today from London. Adel, thank you very much for taking your time to join us today here in Scope. What do you make of the disagreement about mediation to begin with? I mean, why not bring in other actors? Is the African Union well placed to resolve this issue, do you think?
Well, I think that the problem was that the two sides, and especially the Ethiopians, should have taken politics out of this equation. I mean, you referred to the Egyptian leadership making some kind of warning and so on. That also has to be taken into the political context of the internal consumption. There is some kind of hydraulic imbalance as well as economic imbalance in the whole of the Nile Basin. And they used to be 9, now they are 11 riparian nation there. And there are actually 2 rivers, the Blue Nile and the White Nile. Now, when the basic was the 1929 Nile Basin Treaty, which was drafted by Sir Winston Churchill. And it's pretty, very good, actually, one to start with. The problem is, you had this military coups regimes and revolutionaries and so on, and they started chipping away in that treaty and came up with various agreements, the 1959 agreement and so on, rather than going back to basic. So you have the Egyptians who are very advanced and using the majority of the Nile water, but 85% of the water comes from outside their border, while the other countries are economically disadvantaged, but also needed help. I mean, they should have moved earlier, but it's actually a bit late now. So what they needed to do, they need to look into environmental cost, into economic cost, and international law. International law have a basic rule which is called the customary use. And that, in fact, was the first intervention was the World Bank between 1947 and 1949, between India and Pakistan, when the two nations wanted to build dams, and then they said, okay, you have to have some kind of an agreement that to not a zero-sum game, but to share benefits and share cost and so on. And that became the blueprint for cross-border waterways agreement on any hydraulical project.
Right.
And the example of customary use is, say, for example, you have a piece of land away from the road and from water supply and electric and so on. I can't come and actually build my house in front of your land and block your access. You have a customary use to the road and the water supply and so on. So by law, even any court in any country will give you the right that I must actually leave a passage that a lorry or a fire engine can pass. So the customary use has been neglected by Ethiopia, which is affecting 3 other countries, Egypt, Sudan, and South
If I may
Sudan.
come in, Adel, I really appreciate, and I'm sure viewers appreciate the context that you provided there for, water and how important that is at the core of this. But I wonder, why have we gotten to this point? I mean, the dam is already built. Why wasn't there more uproar, or was there uproar back when the dam was being built? I mean, I've been following the story for a while, but it seems like it's just recently picked up a bit more, like in the past year or so. I would have imagined that this sort of alarm should have been raised a lot earlier on in the process by the likes of the Egyptians and the Sudanese.
But I did have this discussion actually with the Egyptians back in 1993, even President Mubarak himself, when I sort of suggested a plan of action that they should be involved in the water project with Ethiopia and with Sudan and with the rest of the Nile Basin nations. They should be, there's something called the Jonglei Canal, which is the water that evaporates from the White Nile coming from Central African Mound, not from the Blue Nile from Ethiopia, is actually more than what the Egyptians get from Ethiopia. By actually dredging these 2 canals, they can increase, the Jonglei one can actually give between 3.3 to 5 billion cubic meters per second. And the second Jonglei will be added another 4.5, so that actually almost 9 to 10 billion. That's more what that comes from Ethiopia, which is 7.5 billion. And they should have really involved Ethiopia, financed the dam. They should have used electric coming from the Aswan Dam in Egypt and so on. But the reason, in my view, which I actually don't know, I don't want to second guess, the Ethiopians were thinking politics to use it as a leverage because they are landlocked, the country, and the Egyptians probably were supporting the Eritreans, using as leverage against Sudan and so on. So the Egyptians also were busy with sort of internal politics and revolutions and so on. So I think they did not take politics out of it. Let's not forget also that damage to the environment.
Yeah.
The dam should have been built over 16 years. They are actually filling it over 5 years. Enormous damage to the environment because of
Adel, I'm going to cut you off again. I do, because we're quickly running out of time. So I wanted to get a final word from you. What then happens next, right? Because at this point, I mean, to me at least in all the reports I'm reading, no one's actually saying that the dam should be completely destroyed. At least that's what I've understood from the Egyptian and the Sudanese side as well. But nevertheless, I mean, if it's already built, they're about to fill it for the second time as well, and that will be, a significantly more amount of water, certainly, than what's currently in the dam. This seems like an irreversible process, doesn't it?
Well, no, what they could do, they can start actually opening some gates and release some water in order to. The Egyptians got plenty of water in the Nasser Lake, huge amount. It's not a big deal. But I'm worried about the damage to the river bed itself, the environment in South Sudan and South Egypt. They should release water, and they should reduce the time and the speed, the process of filling it. They should expand it for another 10 years, even for the Ethiopian themselves, because the flow of water running and of the silt coming would actually damage the Ethiopian plain themselves. They should not think politics. If that doesn't happen, I don't think they're going to go into all war, but we're going to see some kind of covert operation. The Egyptians are going to get fed up. The Ethiopia is not very stable
right
as a society. They got guerrillas and so on. So we're going to see skirmishes and instability rather than the two sides reaching an agreement.
Very well, Adel. We really appreciate you taking your time out of your busy schedule to share your expert insight with us. We were discussing there the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which has become a headache for the likes of the Sudanese as well as the Egyptians. The dam's already built, though, as we discussed there with Adel, and he contextualized for us. Nevertheless, there are, in his view as well, routes that the Ethiopians can take to ease the damage, the environmental damage primarily, because that's always an issue when we're talking about dams anyways, regardless of water flow to other countries, which is, of course, also extremely important. The Egyptians, as I said, Sisi had made quite a dire warning to the Ethiopians, but would they actually go to war? I mean, as Adel mentioned, it's possibly doubtful, but one never knows. I mean, and this has been something that's been warned about in the past, right? That climate change may possibly at some point in time create conflicts around now natural resources such as water and otherwise. Is this the case this time around? We'll, of course, have to wait and see as well. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss the U.S. Capitol attack once again. There's been a survey or a research conducted, by Chicago Project on Security and Threats, which is known by its abbreviation CPOST. And according to this study, it says that out of the 377 Americans or so who were involved in the U.S. Capitol attack on January 6th, they hail from places, a lot of them, I should say, hail from places where non-white populations are growing fastest. Many of them are also from quote-unquote blue areas, i.e. areas where Democrats are more in control politically, municipally, etc. This all then also goes to that entire theory of the Great Replacement, something which we've seen play out a lot across Europe as well, and we've discussed that previously on this show, where essentially there's a concern that minorities are replacing the white populations due to mass immigration and low birth rates amongst the more white populations. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Doctors Shannon, Reid and Jason Opal. Shannon is an assistant professor at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, in criminal justice and criminology. She's joining us this morning from Charlotte, North Carolina. Jason is an associate professor and department chair of history and classical studies at McGill University. He's joining us this morning from Montreal in Quebec. Jason and Shannon, good morning to you both, and thank you for joining us. Jason, let me start with you. What do you make of this report? I imagine that obviously with any such studies, there are probably a lot of concerns about how they were conducted, but just on the overall point of the Great Replacement and how that is viewed by white supremacists, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think two things really jumped out at me in that report. The first is, again, to be clear, it seems like about 800 people or so actually entered the Capitol, of whom about half have been charged or criminally pursued. And what's struck out for me is that there is this link between counties where the non-Hispanic white population is declining rapidly and various forms of white extremism or right-wing extremism, but also that apparently about 60% of these rioters had severe financial problems in the past, kind of small entrepreneur problems that are related to bankruptcy or being sued by a creditor. So that's one issue. But in terms of the Great Replacement, that refers to a 2011 book by a far-right French writer, but the roots go way, way back. The kind of fear that non-white, historically black populations would actually replace poor white or middling white workers is extremely deep in American history. It actually reaches back even before the revolution. But only, I think, since the 21st century do you have this as an ideology. In the United States, I would trace it to Pat Buchanan's book in 2001, The Death of the West, which talks about low white birth rates and high immigration rates from non-white countries. And we've seen over the last 10 years is that ideology has kind of metastasized and gone viral and become a core part of the extreme right.
Shannon, what strikes me as odd is that we've been told many times, and this is probably still true, but I want to get your thoughts on this, that when you have people-to-people contact between different ethnicities, minorities, etc., with a white population and vice versa, that's always a good thing, right? That in fact lessens stereotypes, prejudices, biases, etc., both ways. In this case, though, we're talking in many cases, not all cases certainly, about people who live in quote-unquote blue areas in fairly diverse communities. Why would they still then, for some of them at least, still sign on to the likes of the Great Replacement Theory, etc.?
So I think that brings up a really good point about the idea that, being in a neighborhood that is diverse reduces sort of racism and concerns about, interracial relationships. And unfortunately, that is true in some places, but as the turnover is happening, there is a concern about how that turnover impacts people's businesses, people's homes, right? It goes back to those racial stereotypes of how diversity impacts a neighborhood and a community. And I think the issue with it sort of being the sense of, it's in blue neighborhoods or blue areas is that it sort of overrides the idea that cities are still exceptionally racially divided. So even though a city, so if we take Charlotte, for example, Charlotte is very blue, but it is also very segregated in how the city is designed and how housing is built. So even though we might say Charlotte is a very diverse city, the neighborhoods and the communities themselves may not be very diverse. And so as you see neighborhoods turn over and vice versa, right? As neighborhoods are gentrified, you can see violence and other issues appear, is that it takes a while for that to sort of, I don't want to say integration because it's a loaded term in the United States, but for that feeling of community to rebuild itself.
And what are your thoughts about diversity in that sense, right? Within a neighborhood, within a city. I mean, you live in Montreal. Montreal is a fairly diverse city. Canada overall is quite a multicultural society. Are there parallels that you see here, or is there a significant difference, do you think, between American cities and Canadian cities, for example?
No, it's a really good question and a very broad one. I'll put it this way. I think that there is an interesting correlation. It's not a causation between certain political traditions and the sort of the intensely political fear of the replacement of the ordinary people or the real people or the real nation. And that has to do with countries, Western countries that are republics versus those that are historically monarchies. There is a theory and some evidence that monarchies or traditional monarchies, although more inegalitarian in their political rhetoric, sometimes have a slightly easier chance or easier time. They can allow for a certain degree of tolerance, and that tolerance can then become actual forms of community in ways that sometimes republics cannot. So things, countries like Canada, obviously the UK, but also Sweden, Denmark, Belgium, they're actually still monarchies, the democratic monarchies. Perhaps they have some degree of an ability to, maybe the word integrate isn't the right word, but kind of allow for greater diversity. Whereas you do see this pretty vivid tradition in two republics, the United States and France, both of which were also kind of imperial republics with large areas devoted to slave-grown agriculture. Those areas do have these vivid traditions of racist nationalism that's aggrieved nationalism. In other words, the sense that both that white persons or people of Northern European descent are thought of as both superior and threatened. And you see this, it's quite distinct in a French and American U.S. tradition. This is not to, I don't want to paint too broad of strokes, but there is that interesting correlation, and it might speak to some deeper political tensions in republics.
In the midst of all this, Shannon, obviously within this Great Replacement Theory and the fear of being, becoming the minority in quote unquote your own country, so to speak, then we have social media thrown in with all this, and we have a whole bunch of hate groups online, both sides, obviously. I mean, hate groups of all kinds, but also white supremacists online, especially the dark web, also increasingly because they're being essentially banned on the more mainstream platforms, I should say. What do you make of that as a huge factor in then increasing this sort of feeling? Because I would imagine that more and more people then face this sort of thing or read about it and possibly are convinced.
Yes, the internet has played a huge role in what we sort of think about as a force magnifier. So while these conspiracy theories have been around a very long time, and we've heard different iterations of them, especially every time a census year shows up and they make population predictions, this comes back around. The internet has certainly played a huge role in who this information and who these conspiracy theories reach. And that reach has really expanded to populations that not that we were unconcerned with, but rather than it sort of being the mainstreaming of it, and the rhetoric by former President Trump certainly has helped fuel this into the mainstream in a way that probably would not have been as feasible without access to the internet. Because even though the serious groups have been deplatformed, they are certainly able to put through other people their memes and their quick sort of hidden messages, the dog whistles in public platforms that then get repeated by more everyday, citizens. So this is why we see, with family member, people are saying, "Oh, my family members are repeating this," and people that you wouldn't have, sort of originally thought would be swept up in these sorts of conspiracy theories.
Indeed. Jason, this I wanted to get your thoughts on the role that the internet plays in all this. But secondly, I wanted to also ask, what does this then mean for citizenship overall then? Because that needs to be defined as well, right, for these people. Because, again, these countries, such as the United States especially, considering that's the topic of discussion, is made up of people from all over the world. And many people have been there for generations, but nevertheless, their origins may be of somewhere else.
So just to pick up on Shannon's point, it's really crucial to I think of the role of the internet, and specifically, so why is this? Why does the internet tend to magnify and intensify a fringe belief rather than expose it to other ideas? And I find it useful that the concept of the consequence-free community that the internet creates. So in the past or in other contexts, someone with extremely racist thoughts would perhaps still have to deal with down the street, there's someone of a mixed race couple or an uncle who is gay or something else that would kind of moderate or at least contain their extremism. But now all one has to do is link on to an alt-right website, and all one will hear is the most extreme versions of things repeated endlessly, thereby intensifying rather than moderating, a kind of right-wing or white supremacist view. But to the second point about citizenship, it's just crucial, I think, to be very clear that there's always been a tension in American history between the population in general and the so-called nation, right? So the word nation has a root to birth or nativity. It tends to refer to kind of like a family group. And there's this long tension of distinguishing the nation or the real nation versus the overall population. So that white people have had this long claim to be the true nation, whereas everyone else is just visiting or threatening the United States. So to confront that, how does one do this? One has to name it, describe it in those terms, I think, and make a commitment to an active sort of rhetorical, but also political commitment to treating Americans, as hackneyed as it might sound, as equally American.
Yeah. Shannon, I want to give you the final word. This issue of citizenship is one that's come up a lot, especially during the pandemic, right? Especially in the context of Asian Americans too, where a lot of them have reported that they've been continually asked, where are you really from? Even though many, many, many of them have actually been born in the U.S. or possibly second, third generation Asian Americans. What are your thoughts on citizenship in this regard?
So, I agree with what Jason said, and it is a very important distinction that there is a sense of America is white And that white supremacy has been adopted by all of our systems. So especially, the criminal justice system, the courts, right? All of these pieces are there to sort of uphold these white supremacist beliefs and structures. So while, we say politically, rhetorically that, yes, we are all equal, we are all citizens, right? People have been here for generations. Unfortunately, how we combat that idea that America is white, non-Hispanic, to be more specific, is very difficult because we have so many systems in place that are meant to uphold that belief and allow that belief to flourish, and just how we react to these different events, and even, how we question where people are from. And so the idea of citizenship and how we tackle that is going to require a lot of work in a lot of levels of the United States. It's a very large problem.
Very well. With that, but we really appreciate Shannon and Jason for taking their time out this morning, speaking to us respectively from Charlotte and Montreal, sharing their expertise with us about the entire discussion of the Great Replacement Theory in the context we were speaking of the Chicago Project on Security and Threat Survey, which looked into around half or so of those who have been who took part in the U.S. Capitol riot. Around 377 of those rioters were arrested. Then there was a survey done into their backgrounds, where they lived, and a lot of them live in what we would describe as blue or democratic areas in fairly diverse neighborhoods. Why then would they still feel, if they do feel that they're being replaced as white people by minorities and other ethnicities? I mean, the U.S. is, at the end of the day, an immigrant country. It's been made up and has been made up for a very, very long time of people of all walks of life from all over the world who've been there for generations, many of them at a time, and are very much just as American as anybody else. Nevertheless, we've discussed citizenship as well, and the many other factors in this, as well as the role that the internet plays in continuing to propagate such conspiracy theories and really hate speech in many regards. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.